Hi, hello again. Uh, it's been about 10 years, 10 or 11 years since we shot the last tape, and I've had a chance to look at it. And someplace along the way, I realized that I forgot to talk. I neglected to talk about Jeffrey's bar mitzvah, which had several experiences in it that are worth repeating. First of all, the initial problem we had, shouldn't call it a real problem the way I'm going to mention it, is both of Anita's grandmothers were still alive. And since they were Orthodox, they weren't going to travel on the Sabbath. The bar mitzvah itself in the synagogue, of course, had to be held on Saturday. However, we arranged to have the party on Sunday with the express purpose of allowing our grandmothers to come to the affair. Now, everything went very well. Jeffrey really, I think he surprised us. I didn't realize what a nice voice he had until I heard him intoning from the Torah, or the Haftarah, which I think is what he did. So we had the synagogue on Saturday, as I said before, and then Sunday morning we prepared for the big party, which was going to take place at the, I forget the name of it now. That's funny. Let me see what's. Okay, I sort of needed some help to remember where we had the party, but it wasn't in the Galaxy. The Galaxy was a place that was really made to order. That's all they did. It was considered a catering place. And later on, we had Cliff's bar mitzvah there too. And my brother had all 5 of his bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvah at the Galaxy. It was well situated, easy to get to along the Long Island Expressway. So we had this party with Jeffrey, and in those days, we had a cocktail hour first. And then the dinner, and then the candle lighting ceremony towards the end of it. Is that yours? Is the camera still going? They sometimes ignore it, so they don't pick it up. So at the cocktail hour, of course, everybody is mingling. All of the people came in. It was an open bar, and Anita had invited her principal and one of her co-teachers, who was married to the principal of a different school, of a high school in Belmore, I believe. In any event, not like most of the Jewish guests, I think that these people did not realize what an open bar meant. They did not see beer, which was their drink of choice, so they went next door to a Holiday Inn or some hotel there and bought a couple of bottles of beer to come in and have in the middle of our party. It struck me sort of funny, but we really couldn't say anything about it. You don't go over to them and say, hey, you could have gotten your beer here. We didn't realize it right away anyway. In any event, the next thing that happened is after everybody was seated, and this was generally the structure of a bar mitzvah party, you sit everybody down, and then they introduce the parents, Anita and myself, and they introduce the bar mitzvah boy so he can walk out and get all of the spotlight. And they allow all of his friends, and he had a whole bunch of friends that were invited, to go marching out in front of him. And they were sort of lined up. And all of a sudden, my Uncle Abe shows up. My Uncle Abe was a rabbi. I had 2 uncles. Really, they were half uncles. They were half brothers to my father. And both of them were considerably younger. As a matter of fact, my oldest cousin was in the middle of them. So we had that kind of situation where Nady, who passed away not long after the bar mitzvah, but Nady was older than Abe and younger than Lou, and both of them were his uncles. You've heard stories of nephews who were older than their uncles. That was one of the cases in point. Lou had been invited, and he was in a congregation in New Jersey, and it really took some convincing on my part. My father, by that time, was totally blind and had trouble getting around, and who knew how much longer he was going to last. So I begged Lou to come after he turned me down because he said he had something else, or he didn't, whatever the other reasons were. I convinced Lou to come. So Lou came with his wife, Sima. We weren't sure where he was. We invited him, and he was quite a character in his own right. There are separate stories we can tell about my Uncle Abe. But in this particular case, I had been warned a little. My Aunt Hannah, who had some connection with him, she was his sister or half-sister, called us in the morning and said, Uncle Abe, your Uncle Abe is going to show up at the bar mitzvah. I said, really? We had never heard from him. She said, well, I'm not sure, but I think he's in town. And sure enough, as the cocktail hour ended and everybody was seated and the boys were lined up, in walks my Uncle Abe. I said, Abe, what are you doing here? You didn't tell us anything. Wait a minute, I have to arrange for seating. He says, no, don't bother. I'm not staying. And he had a friend with him who he never introduced to me, but if you've seen these old mafia pictures, this guy was dressed with a bulge up here, and who knew what else. But Abe comes up to me and says, introduce me to the bar mitzvah boy. So I introduced him to Jeffrey, and he takes out a checkbook and he writes out a check in pencil. Got pencil with him, he writes out a check in pencil and gives it to Jeffrey. And he says, what other bar mitzvahs did I miss of my nephews? I said, well, Mark was bar mitzvah about 2 months ago, and Daniel, my cousin Stanley's son, was the same year, but earlier in the year. So he goes over to them and he writes out checks for them too. My Aunt Hannah said, when she found out about it, she said, you better get that check in the bank in a hurry, because I don't know. So anyway, and then he disappeared. And I'll tell you the truth, I never saw him again. I don't know what happened to him. It's like he disappeared off the face of the earth. We had Anita met him for the first time when we spent our honeymoon in Miami Beach. At that time, Lou did not have a congregation, nor did Abe. But they wined and dined us and acted properly and took us out to eat and did all these kind of things. When we went back down to Miami Beach near our 10th anniversary, it must have been about 10 years later, Abe, in the meantime, Abe originally was married to a girl up in Glen Cove, New York. But after being married to her, he looked for an annulment very quickly after he was married. What was his grounds? That his wife was hard of hearing. She had a hearing problem. And all of this sounded very funny. The congregation, his wife was the daughter of one of the powers of this particular congregation. So needless to say, Abe was fired, I guess, or had to leave under pressure. And again disappeared from sight for a while, but then he showed up again in Miami Beach and ended up marrying another woman, a very nice looking woman, who happened to be quite wealthy. Her mother, Abe's wife's mother, who is no longer around, was a Ziegfeld Follies girl. And her father owned one of the Union Square department stores. So money was there, and Abe was using it. He adopted her 2 children, And in so doing, he got control of the trust fund of his stepson. But also, with the help of the money, he bought a school. You can't call it a synagogue. It was not a religious school. It was non-denominational, but of course it was very Jewish in its appearance, and probably in the subjects that it was teaching.
It was an established school.
He established it.
He established it.
And he had it authorized by the state of Florida. And many of his students were Cubans. This was before the Castro overtook, or right about the time that Castro was putting his minions together. And a lot of his students were Cubans, as I said before, but they were on both sides of the fence. Some were part of the Batista regime, and some were part of the Castro, the people who overthrew it. And the story that we heard is one of the kids saw this picture on the front page of the paper, and it was his father strung up.
Oh.
You know, really a terrible situation.
Oh.
In any event, Abe ran this school. He ran the school and invited Lou, who was much more reserved, to be the dean of the school. And this is fine. You know, Abe had his PhD, and Lou, of course, was well educated too, so that he ran the school. We came down there, and I contacted Abe. I got way off the story of the book.
That's okay. That's okay. You're covering a little bit of the old ground.
I contacted Abe and Lou, and they invited us over for a very nice dinner. And Abe said, "What would you like to do?" And that's a funny thing to ask, you know.
Mm-hmm.
What do you want me to treat you to? You know, I
Yes.
can't answer a question like that. But he knew of my interest in sports, and he, of course, was in sports too. Interested in it. Of course, I think the sports he was interested in was a racetrack. But that was the beginning of professional tennis. And Pancho Gonzalez, if you recognize the name, was one of the top stars in the professional tennis group that was really trying to start out. So we went to see a tennis match, exhibitions. But before that, we had visited Abe in his office at the school, and he's scanning racing form. He really was into it. You know, I'm not sure what. He spoke about investing in real estate or doing this or doing that. Anyway, it was an interesting visit. He gave us just about as much time as he was supposed to give us. Lou, of course, was much warmer. We ended up going back to Lou's place. Lou had married this girl, Sima, who was quite Orthodox, but also was a Brooklyn College graduate. Because, you know, Anita's a Brooklyn College graduate.
Mm-hmm.
So we sort of had something more in common. She was considerably younger than Lou, but they did have a child. And afterwards, after the school was sold, Lou went back and picked up a congregation in New Jersey, I think around Englishtown, or thereabouts.
Mm-hmm.
So he was really settled, and he was now going to be a real congregational rabbi.
And when you had seen Abe at that visit, and then the next time at the bar mitzvah for Jeffrey?
Yes, that was
pretty
probably
much it.
true.
Mm-hmm.
The next time. But in the meantime, all kinds of stories came up. Anita had her great-aunt Frances and great-uncle Albert living down in Miami. And they used to, or she, her Aunt Frances used to send us articles indicating that Abe was a popular guest speaker at the various congregations, and they kept writing him up. He really did impress people. He had quite a personality. The end of the story is that all of a sudden we heard tales that Abe was wanted by the police.
Mm.
He apparently had absconded or dug into the trust fund of his stepson. So all of this was known, and that's why we were never able to keep track of it anymore. I think he had to get out of Florida. I don't know. They would have to find him first before they could extradite him. But that's the background of Abe showing up at this bar mitzvah all of a sudden out of a clear blue sky.
And that fellow with him was a bodyguard?
Had no idea.
Yeah.
No, I don't know if he was a bodyguard or whether he was part of the mafia. It was around him to make sure he collected
Hefty checks for the,
$25.
okay.
And they were all cash.
Uh-huh.
Even though they were written in pencil, and I had no idea where the money came from or anything like that. But we did deposit them, and it did clear. Anyway, that was some of the high points of the bar mitzvah, which after Abe left. Oh, we have on one of my movie clips of the old 8mm stuff, my nephew Mark, this is on tape, Abe giving the boys the check, but not seeing Abe give the check, but watching Mark looking at this check, and look, who's this strange man that gave me? What is this? You know? And it really was just the way I'm describing it. He had given Jeffrey the check, and then he gave Mark a check, and he gave Danny a check, and disappeared. Never saw me. Never saw me. I'm sure there were talks of his being cited in Las Vegas and thereabouts. Anyway, the party went on, and not much more to say about it. All had a good time. We came up to the candle lighting ceremony, and this I find very sad. And I say this to all of my children and my grandchildren. You have to watch out for this. Jesse, Myra's oldest boy, and therefore the oldest grandchild, was taking care of my father. And when the candle lighting ceremony came up, he escorted him up to the front. And he looked terrible. My father really, it's a shame, because he was such a vibrant personality in his day. You know, that I may have mentioned this before, but they shouldn't remember him this way. And I'm afraid they probably do. All except the oldest, you know, if they can remember him. Maybe I have to check with Jeffrey and see what he remembers of my father. I'm afraid that Cheryl and certainly Cliff are too young to have ever seen this vibrant man move around. So, for the times that we get old, or any of the close relatives get old, never lose sight. Keep pictures, keep reminding yourself of what they looked like before. One other little story, also one of my relatives. My cousin Norman, Stanley's older brother, who's nothing crooked about him but that I know of. But he was a con man. Norman was on his second marriage and married to a very nice girl. We had met her before. And we invited them to the wedding, to the bar mitzvah. And we didn't hear from them. So as is normal, we called up. And I spoke to his wife and asked whether they were coming. And she said, oh, didn't Norman mail it? He was a world traveler who knew where he was at the time. But yes, of course, we're coming. So we set them up. You know, the seating plan, where you put them, always a big problem. And Norman shows up. We had a very cute idea. I can't remember who came up with it. That instead of giving out these cards and telling people where they were sitting, we had somebody in very nice handwriting write on a poster listing every name and telling them what table they were sitting at. Therefore, when you, instead of getting a card and wondering who was going to be sitting at your table or where some other close friend or relative was, you could look at the whole thing and you could see where everybody was sitting. I thought that was very clever.
Yes.
Haven't seen it done since, although it should be. So Norman comes in, and after greeting, he says, I can't find where my sons are sitting. I said, what do you mean your sons? You know, he says, well, I have two of my sons with me. I said, where's your wife? But she couldn't make it. So I said, first of all, the inference was they weren't invited, and therefore they weren't listed. You know, and I see where you're sitting. So, not doing anything at the moment, I said, well, one of them will sit where your wife was supposed to sit, and the other one, well, somebody else didn't show up. So there's a seat over there. So here was this poor kid sitting with somebody he didn't know at an affair he probably didn't know. Norman's second wife was not Jewish. So the children were, you know, not exposed to bar mitzvahs. And this is crazy. After the bar mitzvah, I did something I had never done before. I sat down and I wrote Norman a letter. And I really gave it to him. I said he was very embarrassing because here he comes in with two kids, and there were so many of our friends and relatives who had children the same age who we didn't invite, and they're going to wonder with the two kids there. I said, you really had no right to do this, and you know, really ripped them apart.
Mm-hmm.
Norman and Stanley were brought up in the same house I was. We lived upstairs and downstairs. We were both tenants. We're very close. Norman's about 5 years older than I. Stanley's about 2 months older. So even though we lived in the same house and we were first cousins, our interests were quite different. My relations with Stanley have improved considerably ever since we grew up, you know, and we're very close, Anita and I, with Sylvia and Stanley, and have been close through the years, as I have been with some of my other first cousins. But Norman was 5 years older, and I remember Norman being very nice to me. I mean, I had a faculty with numbers as a kid, and he would show me off to all his friends, you know, with this type of challenge, you know, go ask him a question, you know, put together a question. And 5 years is a big difference. So I really did not know him that well as an individual. I knew some other things about Norman. When Norman got married the second time, there was an item, you know the way they put these items in the New York Times, and it spoke of Norman Katz, who got his master's from Columbia or some such thing like that. Norman never graduated from high school. I happen to know because we went to the same high school, and I was doing some kind of service when I was a senior at Boys High, and I looked up his records, and it was all red. All red. I think he's a very bright guy. You know, he's still around, so I haven't told this to anybody, so this is on tape.
Uh-huh.
I never even told this to Stanley, who came very close to.
Uh-huh.
But that's the type, you know, and he sold himself. His first wife, Bella, was a very wealthy French Jewish girl who was brought up in Switzerland. They got out before. And her father was very big in the French film industry. And that's how Norman got into the film industry. And he was a big macher out in California, connected with, I don't know, it was the 20th Century Fox at one time. I never was quite sure just what he did do, but he lived very well. For example, I hear from Stanley, he has a reserve suite at the Conn's Hotel for the annual big showing out there.
Yes.
You know, for those of you interested in movies know which I'm talking about.
What was his last name?
The last name is Katz, Norman Katz. I never saw his name listed as producer or anything else like that. When he first got into it, there was an outfit called Seven Arts.
Yes.
That was his. Well, that's what his father-in-law's was, and that's how he first got in. And they were producing French films, films made in France, not the other indication of French films. And at a time when it was tough to be making $50 a week, heard that Norman was pulling down $500. Who knows? Never knew what to believe or what not to believe about Norman.
And you never saw his name attached to a specific
did.
film.
Norman's still around.
Mhm.
You know, he's, I'm 81 now, he's 86. And I think what Stanley tells me is that he's starting to get a little bit of Alzheimer's,
Mhm.
the early stages of it. One last note. The letter that I wrote to Norman, Sylvia told Anita and myself that he showed her the letter. He was very mad because of the letter and sort of left it open to discussion as to whether he should respond or what should happen or stuff like that. And Sylvia said she got a big kick out of it. She thought I did a great job in writing him. He had pulled this stunt on my brother when Jesse was bar mitzvah, or Mark, one or the other, where he showed up suddenly with an entourage. Quite the surprise. But my brother accepted all and did nothing. And I wrote the letter, and it was good. I was glad I wrote it. By the way, the next time I saw Norman with no problem, no reference. We were still buddy-buddy, and he was still my first cousin, and so forth and so on. So the letter was written, nothing more was said.
No hard feelings.
So that covers several tales associated with the bar mitzvah, all of which Anita knows, some of which some of the kids may know. I'm not sure how much they do know. But
1966 was the bar mitzvah.
1966 was the bar mitzvah.
And it became a tumultuous time in the country. Jeff was
Well,
moving into his adolescence at a...
yeah, Jeff was moving into his adolescent stage, and I want to talk about that. After the bar mitzvah, several years after, Jeffrey, I don't know whether he was so quiet really, it was quite surprising. There was nothing aggressive about it. I knew his thoughts were with a lot of the peaceniks at the time, but still, he was not revolutionary in his actions. So Jeffrey, in his junior year, started to make his mark in sports. And in his senior year, Jeffrey made the basketball team at Seaford High School. He was the starting center. He was tall, you know. Jeff was 6'3", although the newspapers listed him. And he had a write-up on the Newsday when they were reviewing the different teams. They put him in at 6'4". He had a friend, Mike Pesikoff, I think his name was, who was 6'4", and they put him in at 6'5". You know, it's like same kind of thing that they do with the pros. But in any event, he was their starting center. And at the beginning of the season, Jeffrey started to let his hair grow. Now, letting his hair grow in those days meant it was a little over his collar. You know, we were still, this is before the long hair business. And before the season began, it must have been after watching some scrimmages, or maybe he played his first game or something like that. But one of the scorekeepers, one of the, I guess he was part of the parent-teachers organization, the directors, board of directors of the school district, happened to be one of the basketball fans. And he saw Jeffrey, and he was also very conservative. So he brought it up.